Okay, hello everybody. Well, it's great to have another contributors meeting. And first thing, I'm gonna apologize because having a bit under the weather and I probably don't sound my best, but I did a bit of a recovery today, and I think we can go ahead with this and check what has been going on with running WPE on Android and which plans we have going forward. So let's get to it. For those who don't know me, I'm not going to talk about Igalia. I really Mario did yesterday. I'm one of the people from the WebKit team, and I used to be a systems administrator, which is kind of funny, but I ended up through a process ending up here doing mainly platform code integration with different systems, like kind of trying to cover integration mostly of what's WebKit with whatever clients need in whatever kinds of devices they have. But yeah, I do a bunch of things, including releases, as some may know. And if you have a spare all-bit 8-bit computer and you want to get rid of, you can hit me up and I will be happy to adopt it. Well, first, very quickly, I'm gonna go through what's WP Android and why do we want it, very quickly. Then what we have been doing and when in the last, beginning of the project, and but especially in the last year, and then what are we doing at the moment and why. And also one thing that will maybe stop a bit is some of the features that we recently introduced in WP to better support Android. Maybe I will comment a bit more on those because I think it's kind of interesting, and they are gonna enable improvements also for the ETK port and for other parts of WebKit, hopefully. So yes, what is WP Android? I think it's clear, but in case it's not, it is not a new port. We basically picked what is the WPE WebKit port. We wrote an Android backend for it, and then a custom widget that integrates with the rest of the widgets toolkit that is available in Android, so one can have a web view that is implemented internally by WP WebKit. And we did this starting with the legacy. I like to call it legacy nowadays, the legacy API. Mario touched a bit on his talk yesterday about this. I will touch it a bit later why we are switching to a new API, but it's getting there to work with both, and so we have to write in that backend. But anyway, the interesting part of this is that I would like to highlight is the flexibility of the WPE port, because it doesn't mandate any toolkit or any other kind of windowing system. We can do this kind of slightly crazy things, like plugging it into a completely alien system like Android with relatively minimal changes, as we'll see. And we have like kind of a mini browser built. It looks like this. It doesn't look like anything special because in the end, that's the thing. It has to show web content. And yeah, it looks like this. It doesn't look surprising. It looks like a very minimal browser that runs on Android, and it shows web pages. That's the whole point of it. So that's not surprising that it's simple. And the motivation to have it is there's a few of them. One of them is that some hardware manufacturers provide an Android or AOSP-based system as their board support package. So if you get a chip from them, they will give you an Android-based thing that maybe doesn't have the whole Android stack. Maybe it has only the native parts and the minimal part of Android APIs, which is anything related to Java. And we would like to support those, for example. And at the same time, it's kind of nice to also make it work on full Android and have a proper widget. And one of the nice things about this is that then we have a stable target platform, stable from the point of view of it's well known, the APIs have been stable for a long time. We can choose which APIs to target, and we can expect that every device that implements that API level should work, which also enables us, hopefully, to provide binaries, and we're actually providing them. So it's convenient from the point of view of providing the libraries pre-built, for example, and people can do their own applications based on WP Android without having to build the whole thing. Given that now we have WP WebKit, or we have had it for a few years, it seemed like a fun task at the beginning to bring back WebKit to Android. For those who don't remember, the Android web view used to be WebKit. Nowadays it's Chromium. And because we have WP, we don't need a whole part. And it's a good proof, a good test as something that is very adaptable. So those were more or less the initial motivations to have WP WebKit running on Android. But there is more things. It's nice from the point of view that WebKit is easier to customize and adapt, or at least that's the experience that many of us have. And it can be that some people also want to avoid relying on Chromium or Google, and then they have a different option, hopefully, because it's still experimental, it's still in development. And why not? At the same time, we get web engine ecosystem which is a bit more diverse, and it's I would love it if there could be more web engines, more variety, but we're not at that point yet. But this is like a small contribution towards that. This is a very quick overview of the history of the project. It actually started quite a while ago, 2017. And it was like a very rough demo in the beginning, from 2017 until 2023, that Igalia got grant from the NLNet Foundation to work on this, and then we gave it a big push and implemented a lot of things which were missing. We were disabling a lot of security features. For example, we didn't have multimedia playback, we didn't have WebGL, we didn't have WebDriver support, we didn't have process swap on navigation, etc., etc. We had a lot of stuff during this period because it was like really rough in the beginning. Then we continued after the grant ended because there was a good momentum, and we got also inside Web Inspector support, HTTP2, device output scaling, etc. Like lots of good stuff. And this year, what we have up to June, which is more or less around the time of the Web Engines FactFest, where I did a similar presentation, but not exactly the same one. I was commenting that already. Like at this point, we are also running Skia for rendering on Android, and the WebKit, WP WebKit build we have for Android works practically out of the box from the main branch, which it is true now. It was getting to be true at that moment. We had like a few pending things to make that possible, but it is now there. And since then until now, October, we have been working on adding support inside WebKit for buffer sharing using the native Android A hardware buffer API, have working WebXR on it. One can clearly see there the spike in JIT activity after 2024 when we got the grant, and then we started to like take it more seriously, and then continued after it finished. So things that we did. So first thing, to be able to have everything upstream, I said this is not a WebKit port, but yet we introduced a guard that we can use to enable and disable some code depending on whether we're on Android or not. This was only preparation, simple stuff, very important because everything else has banked on that. And then the next thing, it was not exactly the next thing, but the next thing we should have done was work on logging, because debugging on Android is not a fun task. And to begin with, a release build on Android would by default use the standard error logger, which is not enabled in normal builds. Only the release logging is enabled, but not the rest of things. And then also the standard error logging on Android is possible if you're working on Java, but if you're working on native code, it doesn't go anywhere. It basically goes to dev null. There are ways to go around this, but imply a development setup, custom scripts, custom builds, etc. And it was not convenient, basically. So what we did was a series of patches that partly cleaned up the logging system, and then implemented the possibility of using system properties and enabled all the logging, like similarly to how it's done for Cocoa with this OS log or when we have the login to the systemd journal, we basically always have all the login channels built in, but disabled by default, and then they can be enabled at runtime. And now we have the same in the WP Android builds, and this has been very, very handy to get things going. And then another thing that we have been patching since the beginning of times was that on Android, certain APIs are either forbidden or not available or disabled. For example, the device nodes for dev SHM are not available. The POSIX share memory, SHM Open and Friends, is not available in their C library. For a while, there was this dev HMEM device that one could use, but it has been forbidden after, I think it was Android 10. So in the end, we had to start using some of the native APIs provided by the NDK, by the Native Development Kit. So the first one was to use this share memory API, and then we have a way of sharing non-graphics buffers mainly between different processes, for example, compile content extensions or messages for IPC when they go over a certain amount of size. Sometimes we share memory for them and so on. So there's a number of situations where we hit this API, and now the patch for this is upstream. And then the bigger ticket was the graphics buffer support. The thing with the legacy API that I was calling is that it completely leaves to the person implementing the backend for a certain system how to share things among processes. It's a complicated API. I can comment a bit on this later if we have time, but basically it's something we have been moving away from it. And if we move away from it, WebKit has to provide itself buffer sharing mechanism, and then the new WP platform API that works only on the UI process. So that means we have to have some way of sharing buffers inside WebKit, passing them over IPC and so on. Unfortunately, even when a vendor may choose to implement, to reuse JVM internally in the implementation of their graphics drivers for Android, or they may choose to use KMS, like the kernel mode setting API, or even leave DRM internally, those are not public APIs. And also we don't have, again, access to the device nodes directly, so we cannot do it either. There's a custom API for this that goes through a few layers of abstraction, and this could be a different talk completely, like what was the evolution of graphics buffer API in Android since the very beginning. There has been like 3 or 4 different ways of allocating graphics memory and for drivers to implement their memory allocation and so on. But nowadays there's a unified API, sorry, and we can use this. And the tricky part was to the most complicated part was to get it playing correctly with the IPC, because we don't have an API that provided to us that allows us to pick the components of each buffer and serialize them ourselves. The only operations we have is serialize this buffer to a socket or to a file descriptor, or fetch data from a file descriptor and reconstruct a buffer. But it's working now, and after this series of patches, we have the IPC support, we have custom buffer type exposed in the WP platform API, and we have the support to use this for WebXR buffer sharing. And the motivation for this is that on top that on the WP platform API, we don't allow the implementation of the backend to define its own buffer sharing mechanism. This way we can also control buffer allocation from the content rendering process to the UI process, and we can communicate between them to negotiate the capabilities of the graphics hardware and which pixel formats are available and so on. So WebKit has all the knowledge it needs to provide zero copy operation in those cases where it's possible. And that is why we prefer to go through this additional work to have this support inside WebKit, instead of leaving to the implementer of a backend to to do this, because we want to guarantee that what we have is the best implementation possible and that we can take advantage of every optimization we can. And as an aside from the work on adding the support for the Android hardware buffers, we did a number of cleanups, because there was, in the GTK and WP ports, both of them, because they share a lot of code, there were many assumptions about either using GVM as the generic buffer manager. It's a library that comes on desktop Linux and many regular Linux, non-Android embedded devices as well, or the libdrm. DRM is the direct rendering manager library. And we had a lot of symbols with DMA buff in their name, and now that we have a new way of sharing buffers, which is the Android buffers, it doesn't make sense to have it there. And it was not only renaming, we also moved code around, created base classes for some of the texture, for the accelerated surface, for example, to reuse code between the different buffer types and so on. This has been also a nice battery of patches that has made it possible that in the future it's going to be much easier to add new buffer types when the moment comes. And while we don't have any concrete plan at the moment for that, an example would be if we start to adopt Vulkan, something we could do is much more easily nowadays add support to share buffers using Vulkan external memory objects, for example, because we have all this preparation work already done. So this was also a very nice thing to do. And like I mentioned, we have WebXR support. It's done through OpenXR, and it's working both for the WP and the GTK ports, and it has been rewritten to match the Cocoa port architecture, like what the Apple ports are doing. And if you're interested in this, Sergio has a talk that I recommend to attend, because he's going to talk much more about this. But the summary is, we had an initial implementation that did everything from the web process, which is not something we should do, and it was very ad hoc in some parts, and basically we tore it apart and built it back on top of nicer primitives. And for buffer sharing on Android, we're using a hardware buffer. This, because the WebXR code paths are a bit separate from the regular web content rendering, has a different code path that doesn't go through the texture mapper. So it can be used with the legacy API and with WP platform both. So if somebody wants to steal or needs to steal the old API but wants to have WebXR working with the hardware buffer support, it's possible. And now, things which are currently doing, which are in progress, or we're gonna finish soon, or maybe we start doing soon. We have a patch already. We have had it for a while. Thing is, for many reasons, it has been slowly to review, and we're gonna have support on the accelerated surface and texture mapper to use a hardware buffer soon. And this will finally allow using WP platform on Android, using zero copy, using a hardware buffer for the graphics. This should be done in the coming weeks and landing in May. And another place where we can use graphics buffers to allow zero copy operation is with video content. We have looked a little bit into it, but it's not a pressing matter at the moment, so we don't have an estimation of when we're going to start on that. But yeah, that's something that will be coming at some point. There are more things that we're doing, and this is something that some people want to do, is having support to pick page icons. For example, you're making a browser, you have a bookmarks page, you want to show the icons of the page next to the bookmarks, or you want to create shortcuts on a desktop that go directly to a page. We should use the icons that the page provides. And we didn't have support for this API. This is how our public API is called in both ports in WebKit Favicon database. We didn't have it in the WP port, and we're currently working on an improved API that will support inspecting all the icons that a page declares instead of only one, like it's done now for the GTK port, and this is going to be available for both ports when it's completed. This is ongoing right now. We have landed one patch or two, and the next one is reviewed and ready to go, and then we have a few more planned to continue improving it. But this is something we're also working on, and it's going to be at least used by the WPE and GTK ports. And we will deprecate the current API in the GTK port, and in the WPE one only expose the new one. And something that is also being worked on is support for web extensions, and it's work in progress, and it takes time. It's kind of a big feature, so we don't have an estimation of when it's going to be done, but it's progressing nicely. And for both of these things, something we're adding to the API is a way of representing a new type to represent images. And this is going to be used both for the new page icons API and for the web extension support. So that's something that is also in review right now. Which plans do we have going forward? Well, there's quite a few things here. I think I'm going to touch only the most interesting ones. And one is now that we have the main branch able to build for Android without any kind of patch. Something we want to do is in the repository where we have the integration with Android, which is external code, it doesn't need to be in WebKit. We want to make a branch for the current stable release, switch it to the main branch, and then instead of building packages releases from WPE WebKit, we want to switch it to build from main, so we can periodically update which revision from main we build. So it's going to be easier for us and for people wanting to test new stuff, to pick a newer snapshot and have fresh WebKit with all the new developed stuff. We'll be switching to the WPE platform API. We have a proof of concept that is working, but yeah, we have to land that patch that I mentioned to have the texture mapper use a hardware buffer, and then we can start also using it to implement the web view widget in Android. But we have a version in a branch already working, which is a proof of concept, and it's working well enough to prove that it works and is the way to go. And then there's a lot of things that we are not yet integrating with that we could. One of it is integrating with the Android Power Manager, for example. That is something we don't do at the moment, so if one is watching resource-intensive web pages on Android, your device is going to heat up a bit and consume more power than it's really needed and this kind of thing. So that has not been a priority for now, but it's one thing that we'd like to do. We don't have support for certain kinds of gestures, geolocalization, etc. So that's all things that we have in mind that we don't really have a time frame for them, but time allowing, we will be picking from this list. And currently we ship a lot of share libraries inside package and an Android application package. We would like to reduce that and have the minimum amount of libraries, do something similar to the jumbo builds that Chromium is doing for Android. But it's a complicated task. We tried it once, and we may try it again. It's just difficult, basically. And we may have some improvements to the mini browser coming as well, and maybe it's not going to be so mini anymore. But that's about it. I think we have maybe a minute or two, so I'm gonna mention very quickly, because I really like the new WPE platform API. So I said that I will mention why we want to switch to it. One of it is that the old API, the legacy API, is hard to use. So for example, with the legacy API, a browser that has a Wayland backend and is a small browser, kind of a mini browser itself, this launcher, clocks at, well, 8,000 lines. The WebKit browser with the legacy API goes around 600, including a Wayland backend. But if we use WPE platform, we can do something like this. And of course, this doesn't provide custom integration with your current system. But if you have a regular Linux system, we have simple backends inside WebKit itself that can be enabled. And we have one for Wayland, one for kernel mode setting, which doesn't need a compositor. It runs directly on the frame buffer, accelerated. So if you have that kind of situation, you can get away with this 30 lines of code, with this, not even 30 lines, 14 lines of code, and you have a mini browser. So that is one reason. The other reason is the classic API was plain C. It was very flexible, but because basically you could do whatever you wanted, but also made it very complex and doesn't, like I was saying earlier, it doesn't push people to do things the correct way, for example, to have pixel format negotiation and avoid buffer copies or buffer pixel format transformations. So we wanted to avoid that kind of complication for the people who want to integrate WPE on their system, so they can focus on having an API that is only used from the UI process. They don't have to worry about IPC, they don't have to worry about buffer sharing, which can be complicated. So it's much easier to use, and we know that the complicated parts, like for example buffer handling and IPC, is done inside WebKit. We control that, so it's going to be easier for integrators to use, and in this way we encourage better practices. So that is the motivation for this move to the new WPE platform API, and also the reason why we started looking into adding support for a hardware buffer when running on Android, which then resulted into many other things that we did on the side to have things working and to improve developer life, like with the logging stuff and so on. And yeah, that's basically what I was saying. Actually, also there's some WPE platform builds on all the experience we had with the old one and all the pain we had with the old one. So it has features that we didn't have before that are possible now with a better architecture. Like for example, we can do a proper vsync and integrate the platform vsync and full funnel that into WebKit and feed that into display link, which is something that wasn't possible before. And there is one thing that we still need for Android, which is on Android it's not possible to exec binaries directly. So we have to figure out how to do the process launching part using WPE platform. But it's not worrisome because we can use that part from the legacy libwpe API, even if we don't have it in WPE platform in the meantime, because it's kind of isolated. And the WPE platform API is still being changed, but it's almost ready. Mario mentioned it yesterday. We desire to have it ready for the next stable release series in March next year. And that's all I have. If anybody has questions and comments, that's the moment now.